The text appeared on my phone screen just as I was finishing up with a customer at my boutique. I am leaving you and moving to Miami with my 20-year-old girlfriend. I have already emptied our joint account. Ha ha ha. I stared at the words, letting them settle like an aftertaste I didn't want in my mouth. My hands didn't shake. My breath didn't catch. My heart didn't race. Mrs. Marion Peterson, a loyal customer in her 60s, was debating between a deep sapphire silk scarf and a muted emerald green one. She had no idea that my husband of 12 years had just ended our marriage through a text message. I helped her decide on the emerald, wrapped it in our boutique's signature silver paper, and wished her a lovely evening. As soon as she stepped out of the store, I locked the front door and turned the sign to closed. Then, I picked up my phone and typed a single reply. Good luck. I could already picture Mark Whitmore's smug, self-satisfied smirk as he imagined me breaking down in devastation. He probably saw himself as the villain in a tragic romance. A man too full of life to be tied down to a woman of 38. A man choosing adventure over obligation. What he didn't realize was that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. Mark had been sloppy in his deception. The late nights that didn't match his pay stubs. The sudden password changes on his phone. His new obsession with the gym, with expensive cologne, with dress shirts that fit just a little too snugly over a belly he was desperately trying to hide. He thought he was clever. He thought I wasn't paying attention. He was wrong. 3 months ago, I found a receipt for 2 at an upscale restaurant called La Mer, tucked inside his coat pocket. That particular night, Mark had told me he was working late. I had nodded, kissed him on the cheek and sent him on his way, while I curled up with a book and a glass of red wine. That night, I had also driven to a bank across town and opened a new personal account. A week later, when Mark suggested merging our finances for simplicity, I smiled and agreed, while silently transferring my personal savings out of his reach. The joint account he had just emptied contained exactly 2 months' worth of deposits. Just enough to keep him comfortable. Just enough to make him think he had won. The rest, safe, untouched, beyond his reach. Another text appeared. Don't bother begging. Melissa and I leave tomorrow. I'll send for my things later. Melissa? The receptionist? The same girl I had met at Mark's office Christmas party last year? I remembered her exaggerated laugh at his mediocre jokes, the way she leaned into him, her fingers lightly touching his forearm when she thought no one was watching. I remembered the knowing glance she gave me when she introduced herself, as if I was nothing more than an obstacle she had successfully removed. She was 20 years old. She thought she had won. I didn't respond. Instead, I picked up my office phone and dialed a number I had memorized weeks ago. It's time, I said simply. He just made his move. My lawyer, Margaret Connolly, had been expecting this call. 2 months ago, I had handed her everything. Copies of suspicious credit card charges, hotel bookings, screenshots of hidden transactions Mark thought I wouldn't notice. I had been watching while he was busy plotting. The paperwork is ready, Margaret replied smoothly. I'll file first thing in the morning. Do you want me to have him served in Miami? No rush. Let him think he's won first. Mark truly believed he had blindsided me. He thought his little text message was a power move, a declaration of dominance. He had no idea that by tomorrow he would be standing in the middle of an airport with invalidated tickets, a canceled hotel reservation, and a legal disaster waiting for him in Miami. My phone buzzed again. I know this must be difficult for you. You're not exactly getting any younger after all. At least you have your little shop to keep you occupied. I smiled. Mark had always referred to my thriving boutique as a little shop, something he barely tolerated, something he never respected. He never saw it as a real business, even though it had tripled in revenue over the past 5 years. He never realized that my boutique made more money than his job ever did. And more importantly, he never realized that I had kept every single business account completely separate from our marriage. I allowed myself a small moment of satisfaction, imagining the look on his face when he realized that his big escape had been funded entirely with his own money, not mine. I poured myself a glass of wine, the expensive bottle I had been saving for a special occasion. This, I decided, qualified. Mark had spent months thinking he was outsmarting me. He thought he was preparing for the next phase of his life, basking in the fantasy of youth and freedom with a girl who didn't know any better. But Mark had never truly known who he was married to. He had been playing checkers while I was quietly building my own chessboard. Tomorrow, reality would hit him hard. And I would still be here, running my successful business, without him dragging me down anymore. The first thing I did the next morning wasn't check my phone for Mark's inevitable meltdown. It wasn't even to confirm that the credit card company had successfully canceled his little parting gift, his first-class tickets to Miami and his luxury hotel stay. No, the first thing I did was open my boutique as usual. Friday was always my busiest day. A new shipment of designer handbags had arrived overnight, and my employees were already unpacking them. I stepped into the shop, greeted my team with a warm smile, and acted like it was just another day. Because for me, it was. I had spent months preparing for this moment. Mark had spent those same months fantasizing about his grand escape. And now, reality was about to slap him right across the face. By noon, my phone had 10 missed calls and 14 texts, all from Mark. I finally took a moment to glance through them, each one more desperate than the last. What the hell did you do to our credit card? The airline won't honor our tickets. The hotel canceled our reservation. Fix this now. Answer me. I sipped my coffee and silenced my phone. Let him stew in it. Let him flail. By mid-afternoon, his mother called. I let it go to voicemail. 10 minutes later, she called again. This time, I answered. Claire, dear, Barbara Whitmore began, her voice the perfect blend of faux concern and veiled accusation. Mark just told us everything. He's devastated. He says you're being vindictive. I smirked. Vindictive? I repeated, arranging a window display. What exactly did he tell you? Well, he said you froze the accounts, canceled his flight, and refused to let him retrieve his things. That's not very fair, dear. I know you're upset, but surely... Barbara, I cut her off. Did Mark tell you he emptied our joint account before sending me a text message to end our marriage? Silence. Did he tell you he used our shared credit card to book a luxury trip with his girlfriend and bragged about it in a text? More silence. Would you like me to forward those messages to you, or perhaps directly to his father? A heavy pause. Then, finally, a resigned sigh. He mentioned something about an account, she admitted. I let the silence stretch, forcing her to sit in the truth for a moment. Barbara, I've always liked you, I said evenly, but I'm going to have to ask you not to call me again. My lawyer has advised minimal contact with Mark's family during the proceedings. Proceedings? She echoed, her voice suddenly full of real concern. Goodbye, Barbara. I hung up. Not even an hour later, Mark's sister Amanda was spreading gossip through mutual friends. Apparently, Mark and Melissa were stuck in a budget motel near the airport. Their first-class dreams had been downgraded to reality. Mark had tried to use his personal credit cards, but, oh, surprise, they were maxed out. He had been drowning in debt for months. I had known. I had just waited. At 5 p.m., Margaret, my lawyer, called with an update. The emergency hearing is scheduled for Monday, she informed me. Given his admission of emptying the joint account and the documented credit card fraud, we're in a strong position to freeze all remaining assets. Has he been served yet? I asked. Not yet, but we'll have the papers delivered to his new motel address, she said with a chuckle. Speaking of which, his girlfriend's social media has been helpful. She's been posting about their adventure all day. I smiled. Melissa had spent all day documenting their glamorous escape to Miami, not realizing that her captions, complaining about unexpected financial setbacks and ruined vacation plans, were pure legal gold for me. Mark's next text came through just as I was locking up the shop for the night. You think you're so smart, but I made copies of all the boutique's financial records. Half that business is mine. I laughed, out loud. He was grasping at straws now. I forwarded his message to Margaret. Another mistake for the file. By Monday, Mark was going to learn the difference between separate business assets and wishful thinking. Monday arrived with a crispness in the air, the kind of morning that felt fresh and new, like a clean slate. It was also the day Mark Whitmore would finally face the reality of his actions. I arrived at the courthouse early, dressed in a tailored black pantsuit, my hair pulled back into a sleek bun. I looked professional, composed, and entirely unbothered, a woman who had already won before the fight had even begun. Mark, on the other hand, looked exhausted. He had traded his flashy, cool dad wardrobe for something far more humble, a wrinkled button-down, slacks that were slightly too loose. His expensive new clothes? Most likely returned to cover the funds he had stolen from our joint account. Melissa was nowhere to be seen. Apparently, her Grand Miami dreams had soured faster than expected. She had gone from being the younger woman he left his wife for to the unpaid therapist of a financially ruined man. She had packed up and left over the weekend if the texts I received from one of Mark's mutual friends were anything to go by. So he stood alone. Good. The judge wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Albright began, his voice stern but not unkind, "you have admitted in writing to withdrawing the entire balance of your joint account before informing your spouse of your intent to divorce. Do you dispute this?" Mark shifted uncomfortably, looking to his lawyer for guidance. I was just trying to make a clean break, Your Honor," he muttered. The judge's eyebrow lifted. "By committing financial misconduct?" Mark's shoulders sank. His lawyer cleared his throat, clearly scrambling to salvage what was left of Mark's case. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges that he may have acted impulsively, but Mrs. Whitmore has been equally vindictive. She has gone to great lengths to cut him off from their shared resources." Margaret didn't even blink. "Mrs. Whitmore," the judge turned to me, "can you clarify whether Mr. Whitmore had access to any shared assets beyond the joint account he emptied?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said calmly. That account was meant for routine household expenses. Our significant financial assets, my business revenue, my personal savings were always kept separate. Mark visibly stiffened at the mention of my business revenue. He had spent years calling my boutique a little shop, dismissing it as a hobby. Yet, now that he needed money, suddenly it was a valuable asset he felt entitled to. Margaret reached into the neatly organized folder in front of her and slid a document toward the judge. "This is a copy of Mrs. Whitmore's business incorporation papers, which show that her boutique was established under her name alone prior to the marriage. Furthermore, we have documentation proving that all business earnings and expenses have been kept separate from their marital finances." The judge flipped through the pages, nodding. "And what is Mr. Whitmore claiming?" Mark's lawyer rushed to fill the silence. "Your Honor, the business grew during the marriage. That alone entitles my client to a fair portion of its value." Margaret's smile was razor-sharp. "Your Honor, what my esteemed colleague fails to mention is that Mr. Whitmore played absolutely no role in the business's success. He did not invest in it. He did not contribute to it. In fact, we have evidence that he actively discouraged Mrs. Whitmore's business efforts, referring to it repeatedly in text messages as a hobby. Would you like to see the evidence?" I had never seen a lawyer deflate so quickly. Mark went pale, his fingers curling into fists. The judge exhaled, looking less than impressed. "Mr. Whitmore, it is clear that your wife took great care in maintaining separation between her business and your marital assets. Furthermore, your own statements, written in text messages, undermine your claim that you should receive a portion of her earnings. Do you have anything to say?" Mark's jaw clenched. "She was always working, always obsessed with that damn boutique," he muttered under his breath. "Maybe if she had paid more attention to our marriage, things would have been different." A cold silence filled the courtroom. The judge's expression darkened. "Are you implying, Mr. Whitmore, that your decision to empty your joint account and leave your wife for a 20-year-old receptionist was her fault?" Mark realized too late that he had just buried himself even further. No, Your Honor," he stammered. The judge set down the papers and folded his hands together. "The court finds sufficient evidence of financial misconduct on the part of Mr. Whitmore. As a result, All remaining shared assets are to be frozen immediately pending the final division of property. Additionally, Mr. Whitmore is ordered to repay the full amount he withdrew from the joint account within 24 hours. Mark snapped his head up. But that money's gone. The judge nodded. Then I suggest you find a way to replace it. Mark gritted his teeth, his hands balling into fists. I sat back, silent and victorious, watching him implode under the weight of his own decisions. Outside the courthouse, Mark's mother was waiting. Her lips were pursed, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Mark stormed up to her. "Did you hear that? She's screwing me over, Mom. She planned this. She set me up." Barbara sighed heavily. "Mark, stop." "No, you don't get it. I have nothing left." His mother's face hardened. "You did this to yourself," she said, her voice cold and clipped. "You're 45 years old and you just got outsmarted by the woman you thought was waiting at home to cry over you." Mark's face twisted, a storm brewing in his eyes. He turned to me, his lips curling into something between rage and desperation. "You planned this all along," he accused. I smirked, adjusting my coat. "No, Mark, I just paid attention." As I walked away, I heard his mother's voice cut through the air. "Honestly, Mark, what were you thinking? A 20-year-old draining accounts, sending those horrible texts?" Her scolding faded into the background as I stepped into my car, exhaling slowly. This was only the beginning. The best part? Mark hadn't even realized how much worse it was going to get for him. It had been 2 weeks since the court hearing, and Mark Whitmore's world had officially fallen apart. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he had failed to come up with the money the judge ordered him to repay. His bank accounts had already been frozen, and his credit was shot from months of bad spending habits. His final resort? Begging. Mark called me 3 times the night after the ruling. I let it go to voicemail. By the next morning, he switched tactics, sending texts that swung wildly between anger, guilt-tripping, and desperation. "You ruined my life. You won't even talk to me. After everything we've been through? I never meant to hurt you, Eleanor. You'll regret this. You think you're untouchable, but karma comes for everyone. Please, just talk to me." I archived each message without responding. It was fascinating how Mark's entire personality collapsed the moment he lost control. Meanwhile, I had never been more in control of my own life. With my boutique thriving, I had begun expanding my business. My second location had recently opened to great success, and I had hired more staff to accommodate the growing demand. What had once been my little shop was now an established brand. A business magazine even reached out, asking if they could feature my story. Not as a scorned woman, but as a savvy entrepreneur who had built something independent and untouchable. Ironically, Mark's downfall had become one of the best things to ever happen to me. And as for him, well, he was still stuck living in his parents' house, still drowning in debt, still desperately trying to cling to whatever was left of his dignity. Melissa, his young girlfriend, had cut ties completely. After their Miami trip fell apart, she realized quickly that Mark was not the charming, successful older man she had envisioned. Instead, he was a broke, bitter mess, blaming everyone but himself for his downfall. By the 3rd week, his mother called again. I debated whether to answer. In the end, curiosity won. "Eleanor, dear," Barbara sighed. "I just wanted to say, you were right. About everything." I let her words hang in the air. "Mark is miserable," she continued. "He refuses to take responsibility for any of this. He keeps saying you set him up like he wasn't the one who threw away his own life." "And what do you want me to do about that, Barbara?" "Nothing," she admitted. "You don't owe him a thing. I wanted you to know that I see it now. He did this to himself." "Yes," I agreed. "He did." I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel angry. I felt nothing at all. Mark was no longer my problem. As time passed, my business continued to grow, my name appearing in entrepreneurial circles as an example of financial independence done right. I spoke at a women's business conference on the importance of keeping personal and professional finances separate. During the Quanda session, a young woman stood up and asked, "My husband says I'm being paranoid about wanting to keep my savings in a separate account. He says marriage means sharing everything. Am I being too cautious?" I smiled. My ex-husband said the same thing, I told her. Right up until he tried to take half of everything I built. Trust your instincts. Protection isn't paranoia. The audience nodded, murmuring in agreement. I realized in that moment that Mark had become nothing more than a cautionary tale. And me? I was thriving. 6 months after the divorce, I opened a third location for my boutique. 1 year after the divorce, I hosted a grand opening for my flagship store, an event attended by local press. 5 years later, my business empire had expanded beyond what I had ever imagined. And Mark? Mark was a ghost from the past, forever stuck in the wreckage of his own making. The last I heard, he was still blaming the world for his failures, still trying to convince people that I had somehow set him up. I kept one reminder of him, the framed screenshot of his cruel text message, the one where he thought he had won. Have fun with your little shop. Beneath it, I had another framed piece, a magazine article featuring me as one of the most successful independent business owners of the year. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting better.